It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Really, thanks go to you for being the people who are so dedicated to the cause of restoring the Constitution that you, like those who originally found it, will help assure that America's future remains bright and that our children will inherit the same world that we did. So I want to, you should thank yourselves as well. And one of the things I did in order to prepare myself for coming here today is I still have 25 pages to go, but I read Senator Mike Lee's book, Our Lost Constitution, and you should take heart in knowing that it's really a compilation of the stories that explain how some of the key provisions of the Constitution actually came to be, how some of them actually have been diluted over the years, and then again restored more recently. And it's really, as Margaret Mead once said, her truism is that it takes a small group of thoughtful citizens to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that's you guys. So thank you for being that small group of thoughtful citizens who's here intending to change the world by restoring our magnificent Constitution. So I thought I would open my remarks with and by the way, you and I had talked about an hour and 15 minutes, Maurice, but I think it's less than that, so I just...
1 hour.
Okay, 1 hour. So I'm going to go at warp speed, and there may be some slides that I have here that I'm not actually going to talk about, so forgive me for that. So just to frame my remarks this morning, I want to ask a kind of funny question that my son is using in his speech to be the 10th grade class president. He starts out with this. He says, if the opposite of pro is con, is the opposite of progress Congress? And we laugh at that because we know that Congress is down there in terms of favorability with used car salesmen. And it's true that you should take heart in this, that the public opinion is on our side. Most people feel that way. That laugh line gets laughs across the spectrum because 8 in 10 Americans are, according to a recent Montpellier Foundation survey, are worried that their constitutional rights are being diluted or taken away. And another survey, the Gallup 3-decade-long tracking poll, reports consistently that Americans are concerned that the federal government does too much and is too powerful. And we all know that this unaccountable, unelected, Leviathan administrative state, the fourth branch of government, has so much power and influence in our lives. It's actually more than the other 3 branches combined. I don't need to tell you that. That's why you're here. Meanwhile, shocking numbers of Americans are actually warming up to socialism. And part of that is because of politicians like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren who've risen to prominence on a fairness appeal, that the system is rigged, which you probably agree with. And that resonates for people. But they say that a handful of rich people shouldn't run the country, but we say back, well, a handful of politicians shouldn't run the country either. That's the retort to that. So as I said earlier, the stories of how the Constitution came to be, how it's been diluted, and how it's being restored is a story of individuals like you who are acting sometimes alone, but often in concert with very few people. And so I'm heartened by the fact that we have this movement. I thank Maurice for leading it here in Colorado. I think it has enormous potential, but the key to its realization is becoming more effective, winsome, and persuasive advocates of these ideas. And that's what this workshop is all about. So on your table, hopefully you have in front of you 3 pieces of paper. One of them is the 6 powers of persuasion, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then the other 2 are papers that I developed when I presented at the Heritage Foundation, and then more recently at the American Legislative Exchange Council. And I was asked to specifically focus on how to message against some socialist ideas that have come to the fore recently. So, but we're also later in this presentation going to work on specifically the planks of the the Convention of the States, and try to workshop those based on the 6 powers of persuasion. And just so you know, what Maurice didn't mention is that I was a columnist in Aspen, Colorado. I was asked by the, after I did a point counterpoint in 2010 on the opinion page, shortly after that, the editor of the Aspen Times asked if I would help him diversify the opinion page, and I always like to joke, it's not because he needed a woman or a Jew. And I was actually scared to be the scourge of Aspen, to be expressing opinions. And so I worked really hard to be hearable, because that's one of the things we teach. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. So in writing my columns, I wanted to be read. And so I developed a certain style, and I sought out the experts in communication like Stephen Covey and Dale Carnegie and others. And I adopted a style that eventually I realized I wasn't really writing opinion. I was actually writing persuasion. Persuasion is different from opinion in that it's a journey that you invite someone to take with you once they trust you to common ground that they instinctively share. And it worked even in Aspen. So, and so the 6 powers of persuasion, just to go over those, because I want to start with, I think what was a very effective speech that Tom Coker gave last year at the Convention of the States conference in, where I forget where it was. And this is a small outtake from it. But just to go through these 6 powers of persuasion, we're going to be workshopping them later in the hour. But to focus on asking questions instead of making declarative statements. It's important to show that you're listening, and as you see here at the end, the 6th one, to use rhetorical devices to pivot to your persuasive argument. You can ask rhetorical questions, and I'll be demonstrating this. But I want to play this to show you how he uses questions. He fights for people. He uses a fairness and compassion frame, and he tells a story, all in about a minute and a half. And I want you to help me identify it. See if you can identify it. That's right.
Here's my question to those that don't want to fix our country. Is what's your solution? How will you fix our country? And here's why it's important. There's 85 million millennials. The average net worth of the average millennial is minus $3,700. A third of them have a college degree that they can't get a job with because it's in either basket weaving or ancient Indian art. So they're not employable. And yet, here's the moral question. Is it fair to steal the future of our children? Because that's what's happening today. Just some short numbers. There's 85 million millennials. Over the next 50 years, they will either through one of 3 ways have to come up with $33,000 a year extra besides their living expenses. That's what $144 trillion in unfunded liabilities and debt, which coming due the next 50 years, is going to bring to them. So ask yourself, is it right to steal the future of these children and our grandchildren? It is a moral question for us today. How is it that the Congress can pass a spending bill and not read it? And spend $1.3 trillion, $300 billion more than they spent in the same period last year, and not know what's in the bill? And mortgage further our children's future. It's fixable, but it's not fixable unless we go back and restore our Constitution. And restoring it means having a respect for the money that we send up there and making sure that it's spent properly.
Okay, so does anyone, I would love this to be as interactive as possible. That's how you learn. So how did he fight for people? Who are the people he's fighting for?
Future children.
Good. Does anyone want to just summarize, looking at the 6 powers of persuasion, how he used them? Or most of them?
Well, you asked the question, where's the money going to come from? how are we going to fix this problem?
Right, right. When you ask a question, you instead of making a declarative statement that the money isn't going to come from anywhere, he's like, but where is the money going to come from? The person who's answering the question then owns the answer. When you make a declarative statement, it's kind of offensive. You're telling people what to think. People don't like to be told what to think. Good, that's good. What else? Yes?
In that question, he was using number 4 of a fairness and compassion frame.
Right.
Exactly. So I've got it here in front of me. Ask yourself, is it right to steal the future of these children? Question mark. And the person who's listening owns the answer. Of course it's not right. So you don't have to tell them it's not right. And then it's a moral question. So that's basically a fairness and compassion argument as well. He also tells a story by talking about, I don't like that he starts with numbers because numbers are numbing. We'll talk about that later. When you tell a story, try to make it not about numbers, but about people. Because the winning side always fights for people. Okay, so, all right, so let's go since we have a little less time than I thought. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page here. I want to make sure that you agree with my premise that our American principles and values and the Constitution that upholds them are the best for the most people, especially the most vulnerable. Does anyone disagree with that? Okay. Now, what about those who are seeking to undermine the Constitution? Do you agree with me that they're actually devastating the very people that they purport to help? Does anyone disagree with that? So are you frustrated like I am that those guys who are undermining the Constitution get to coast on their benign intentions above the wreckage of their policies? They're the kind-hearted, but we're the black-hearted. Is that frustrating? Okay, me too. Does anyone have an explanation for why that is? Yes?
There's a great book that I read recently, and I've talked to Maurice about it, but there are 2 aspects of personality that both the conservatives and liberals share, but conservatives also have an additional 3 or 4. If you talk to them about the additional 3 or 4, they don't hear you because that's not their too. And we've got to.
You're talking about Jonathan Haidt. I've got a
Yes.
slide coming up about that. Yeah. Fairness, compassion, authority, loyalty, and purity.
Well, they don't see the ones that most conservatives see. It just, they don't exist for them. But the ones that we can connect with them on are the fairness and compassion.
Exactly.
And
You said it.
we have to.
You said it. So you basically summarized this slide. I think the undeniable conclusion is that line, that famous line from Cool Hand Luke, what we've got here is a failure to communicate. And that's what this very brief session is designed to help you improve. And I will tell you, if you can remember nothing else from this presentation, please remember this. I give Jack Kemp credit for it, but I think it was said before by, I've heard Teddy Roosevelt and others. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And as Arthur Brooks said, in one of the first Engage to Win workshops that we actually conducted, Engage to Win is my company, I teach and write persuasive communications. One of the first ones he did, he talked about how people will form a judgment of you in as little as 7 seconds. So make sure that people know you care. And we're going to talk about, that's where you are the message, and the power of persuasion, number 1, how people can like you without you even opening your mouth. And remember, it's not what you say, it's what people hear. You have to be very mindful of that. What I learned in writing my column, I figured I have the winning arguments. I'll persuade people, and I realized, not so fast. First, I have to earn the trust of the people I'm trying to persuade. And then my winning arguments, once they're willing to hear them, can win their support. So here's the other thing I learned in writing a column, that the common ground that we have with Americans across the spectrum are these shared values. They're the shared American heritage. And in the parlance of Simon Sinek, and I'm going to be talking about him very briefly momentarily, but Simon Sinek gave the famous TED Talk, Start With Why, how the most persuasive and inspiring communicators, they all communicate in exactly the same way, and it's the opposite of everyone else. They start with why they believe what they believe, not what they believe. And so in my writing my columns, I would always make an effort to start and end with a why, usually in the form of a rhetorical question. But what I found in writing my column is that if I could bring people back to these shared common values and assert them, that I could persuade them. Now, I don't want to suggest that you should fight for these principles. We need to fight for people. But the truth is that these are the principles that created the freest, most prosperous, most decent, most fair society in human history. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's the fairest. And that's why when you can come back to this common ground, people will generally follow you. Now, I will say I have done a talk called "Think There's No Common Ground in Our Politically Polarized Era, Think Again," and that was the name of my column. Think again, you might change your mind. And the goal of my column was to introduce people to ideas and arguments they weren't otherwise hearing, because the essence of a civil society is an informed and thoughtful citizenry. And I agree with Thomas Jefferson that when the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And right now, the people aren't so well informed, therefore the government can't be trusted. So I took that message on the road, and the first time I did it was in Boulder. And I will tell you, of this list, I did get pushback on one of these values. And does anyone want to guess which one I got pushback on? And ever since? Actually, no.
In God we trust.
In God we trust. In God we trust. And so when I put it in the frame of, a fairness appeal, I said, you know, this idea is embedded in our Declaration of Independence, that all men are endowed by our Creator with inalienable rights, that not a single king, aristocrat, president, dictator gives you your rights, nor can they ever take them away. And that was persuasive to them. So here's the other thing. I just to prove the point about America being, that these ideas being helping create one of the most consequential countries in human history, if not the most controversial history, and underscoring this idea that Americanism is a morally superior formula for humanity. You can see that before America, it's not a very good picture here, but you can see that when America came to be in this late 18th century, that up until that point, as Hobbes put it, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Poverty is the natural state that people lived in. But then Americanism came to be, and you can see not only in America, but other countries that adopted Americanism became more wealthy, more prosperous, and today, Americans are so well off, our poverty line begins 31 times that of the global average. And so here, just I want to play, I mentioned that Arthur Brooks, the former president now of American Enterprise Institute, he spoke at one of our first Engage to Win persuasion workshops, and this is just an outtake of what he said, some of what he said.
We don't need a fundamental change in values. On the contrary, our values are correct. Our worldview is right, but we need to talk differently. We have to talk in the way that shows that we are willing to fight for people more than the other guys. Until we do that, we're not going to succeed in our message, and people are simply not going to be drawn to us. That's what I hope to share with you today. How long does it take people to figure you out? Somebody doesn't know you. You're in a debate, you're giving a speech, you're having a conversation, whatever. How long does it take people to figure out you? The answer is 7 seconds. People will assess who you are and what your message is all about. They'll sum you up. They'll put you in a frame.
I think you got that point before. So what is persuasion? So I'd like to see if someone would volunteer a time when someone persuaded them to change their mind. Does anyone have an example of when that happened? Somebody persuaded you to change your mind. What were the circumstances? What was it about that person that helped you change your mind? Does anyone have an example?
Yeah.
Do you never change your mind? Do I have to give you my example then? Okay. Okay, good. I have a volunteer.
I changed my mind on abortion because when I was young, I thought it was reasonable, simply because the people who would...
Well, don't give me the argument. Tell me what it was about the person that changed your mind.
The person who changed my mind was my granddaughter. he was born, I realized can't go that route anymore. Every child is a child.
Okay, so you loved that person. It's probably a push to say that you trusted them, but that's really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, most people will not listen to someone else unless they trust them. My example was of somebody who persuaded me to let my son, my aspiring aviator, fly when I was not predisposed to doing it yet. And he had so much credibility that I trusted him. I won't go into the story. So we all have bullhorns that allow us to project our ideas, but they're useless unless we have the credibility and the earned trust so that people will listen to whatever comes out of that bullhorn. And that's what this session is designed for. You can see even trusted relationships were used in the 50s and 60s to sell cigarettes. Doctors and dentists were used to sell cigarettes. And so one of our challenges, though, now is that we're living through this hyper-partisan era where people live in these thought silos and they are fed by what I call curated tribalism of social media. So on Facebook, you can like the people who agree with you, defriend those that you don't, follow those that you like on Twitter. And so what's happening is that we are forgetting this moral consensus that binds us, those American ideas. And that's what our work is about, is helping people remember those. And I suggest that the way to do it is not by wagging your finger at people. Instead, you're not going to change. It's a silly notion that anyone might change their mind if you're not listening to them and you're just wagging your finger at them. Because I teach an Israel workshop on college campuses, and what's so evident there is kids have tuned out of the Israel debate. They don't know enough to have an opinion, and so they've dropped out. They don't necessarily favor the Palestinian side. It went from 7 to 8% since the BDS movement started, but the pro-Israel side went down 27 points because people have just checked out. They're like, pox on both your houses. I've got a test to study for. So Stephen Covey was right when he said most people do not listen with the intent to understand, rather they listen with the intent to reply. And we got to flip that script and learn how, with these powers of persuasion, learn how to actually listen and be an engaged listener. And if you don't believe that showing that you care and coming across as caring matters, consider Mitt Romney, who cast himself as uncaring when he said that it wasn't his job to worry about the 40% who are dependent and entitled victims. And it was probably the gaffe that cost him the 2012 election. On 3 out of the 4 polling questions, exit polling questions having to do with vision, values, and leadership, Romney trounced Obama. But on that all-important question, who cares about people like me? Romney got trounced by Obama 81 to 18, which means that there are people who actually voted for who voted for Romney, who thought Obama cared more about them. So interestingly, in this last election, you had 2-time Obama voters who voted for Donald Trump. And I'd like to suggest it's because Trump was much better at showing the forgotten man that he talked about in his inaugural address. He showed that he cared. And a lot of these 2-time Obama voters, so they didn't vote for Romney, they voted for Trump because they thought Trump had their back where they thought Romney had the back of their boss, because he always talked about job creators and entrepreneurs. Okay, so here is an example on the minimum wage of how people will talk fighting for things or fighting for the wrong people. And I want to show, it's an outtake from a special election debate that took place a couple years ago between the Republican running for Tom Price's seat, once held by Newt Gingrich. Tom Price had just won it by 23 points in 2016. And the question is, do you support an increase in the minimum wage? And I wonder if anyone would volunteer to answer that question right now. Do you support an increase in the minimum wage? A federally mandated increase in the, yes?
No, I don't support it.
Okay. Do you have a reason? You're trying to persuade someone who thinks they support it, because I will tell you, on this question, it gets about 2/3 majority across the country believe we should increase the minimum wage. So it's not enough to say, no, you don't support it. You have to have a rationale. You have to appeal to the people who think it's good for people.
Kicks
Yes.
a lot of people out of a job.
Okay, so you're fighting for people. Okay, good. All right, so now I want to show you this quick outtake, and then I will show you how I would do it, putting all.
Does either candidate support a minimum wage increase? Mr. Ossoff starts with you.
Yes, I do. The minimum wage should be a living wage. I think we can raise it indexed to the cost of living, because the cost of living varies widely in urban and rural areas and in different states across this country. I think that increase needs to be implemented at a pace that allows business owners to adapt their business plans so they're not shocked. Their business plans are not shocked by a sudden increase in labor costs. But look, if someone's working a 40-hour work week, they deserve the kind of standard of living that Americans expect. That's part of the American dream, and there are too many folks who are having trouble making ends meet.
This is an example of the fundamental difference between a liberal and a conservative. I do not support a livable wage. What I support is making sure that we have an economy that is robust with low taxes and less regulation, so that those small businesses that would be dramatically hurt if you impose higher minimum wages on them are able to do what they do best: grow jobs and create good paying jobs for people in the 6th district.
So, does anyone want to tell me what they think about that? Yes.
I agree. I know people who own restaurants, and if you raise it up to 15 miles per
Wait,
hour.
sorry, you said you agree. How do you think she did?
I think she did very well. There are restaurant owners who would not be able to work anymore if they'd have to close their doors because they couldn't raise the price so high nobody would come in.
I'll disagree with you, but hold on. Yeah.
I disagree. I don't think she did very well. Yeah.
Facts were right.
What?
Her facts were right.
Yeah, but she said, no, she just said, I don't believe in a living wage. And I'm like, that turned me off right away since she said that. She just stumped.
It's better than no wage.
You know what? So, Loretta, you know what? You know why she thought she did a good job? Because she was speaking to the choir. She was speaking to you. But you're already in her choir. She's trying to appeal to people who actually support the minimum wage. And she didn't do a very good job at that. So here's how, using the 6 powers of persuasion, I would have proposed to do it. So, first of all, recognizing the need to pivot to better ground. When your 80% friend is not your 20% foe. So this whole idea of a living wage, you give nothing up to say you support it. It's not the same thing as saying you support an increase in the minimum wage. So what I would have said, and by the way, that's a common ground. Of course I believe that everybody should have a living wage. And then the pivot, I'm using I just worry. I just worry about young minorities, the most vulnerable in our society. And if they, rhetorical question, if they can't get a job at $10 an hour, how will they ever get it at $15 an hour? And if they can't get their hand on the lowest rung of the opportunity ladder, how will they ever climb it to a living wage? And that's not fair. And if you can, if you can end your argument with that's not fair, you're persuading. And you're going to understand why in a second. So here's why this making a persuasive argument is so important. I mentioned that nearly two-thirds majorities actually support the minimum wage. But a Business Insider poll done in July actually asked that question, found these results, 2/3 approximately support an increase in the minimum wage. But then they told them that according to CBO statistics, an increase in the federal minimum wage would result in a loss of jobs. And then it went down from 63 to 37%. So just when people understand that other people get hurt by policies is a way to persuade. And that's what we have to come up with. How are people hurt by the policies that have resulted, by the concentration of power, by the erosion of the constitutional guardrails that we're trying to restore? Who are the people who are getting hurt? We're fighting for them. We're not just fighting for principles. Okay, here's the impact of not making a persuasive case on the repeal and replace of Obamacare. You can see in 2012 that according to this Pew Research poll that goes back to 2000, that by 2012, 40% believed that it was the role of the federal government to ensure health coverage. 40% believed yes, 60% believed no. But by the summer of 2017, when there was the possibility of actually enacting repeal and replace, that had flipped. It was one of the things that was so frustrating to me. I talked to my Congressman, Scott Tipton, about it, that the Republicans were talking only about parliamentary procedures and not persuading anyone about the need to do it. And Republicans had won elections since 2010 at all levels of government by making the case, and which is why you see by 2012 where the polls were. But they stopped making the case once they got power, and you see the result of what happened. Then last year, in the 2018 midterms, Republicans were struggling to respond to this messaging. And I worked with Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's from an eastern Washington district, Washington State District, where a lot of West Coast people have come in there just the way they've come into Colorado and have changed the demographics of her district. And she was polling within the margin of error, and having won by like 20 points originally a decade ago. And so we helped her flip her script, start with why, and the way she responded to the allegation that she didn't support pre-existing conditions was with a why. She said, she has a child with Down syndrome. So instead of getting attacked by her opponent in the first debate, she put her opponent on her heels by saying, I take offense at the suggestion that I don't support pre-existing conditions. My son was born with a pre-existing condition, and I have fought my entire congressional career to assure that all Americans have access to high-quality, affordable health care, and right now they don't, and that's not fair. And then, her 30 seconds was up in her debate, so she did a good job of that. You'll also see that the Green New Deal now has appeal because Americans have come to agree. Even, you can see Republicans that have ticked up support for this idea that climate change is a serious problem that needs immediate action. And then I mentioned before that millennials are warming to socialism. Now, this is just I used to keep until 2016 when I was writing my columns. I always wanted to be sure that whatever I was writing, I was on sturdy ground where there was 60% plus majorities supporting the things that I was fighting for. And you can see this long list. Not important to look at it. But the point I want to make with this overwhelming slide is that the vast majorities actually agree on big issues and share the values when we make the arguments. Okay, so what's the right way to get people to common ground? Well, we have different political types we talk to. In contrast to that left-right spectrum, I hope people are familiar with Leadership Program of the Rockies. I did it in 2015. It's the great program here in Colorado that raised here. So anyway, I did it in 2015, and so I could say a lot about this slide. There's much to say, but you can see here on the left side here, the social justice warriors. I've got Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's picture in there. Capitalism sucks. They're for equal outcomes. They're the ones I call the hostiles. We spend too much time on hostiles. What I want to suggest is you can never convert a hostile. The best you can do is power them down. That has utility, because when you can power them down, especially in front of persuadables, you show how unreasonable they are. So it's worth it, but don't spend a whole lot of time on them, especially since they're only 8%. They're like the pro-Palestinian kids on campus. So to the right, you see the fair and fair economy, law and order, and higher power. You can appeal to all those types of people by going for things that would appeal to them. But what I want to suggest is when we do that, we are turning off the fair and care types, because we say, well, we can't afford Obamacare. Well, then it comes back, well, you want to not insure the uninsurable, the uninsured, and if we say we want to enforce immigration laws, well, you want to deport dreamers and Hispanic grandmas, and then you're put on the defensive, and then of course we want to take away women's reproductive rights. Better to make arguments in terms of fairness and compassion, because not only are they the largest plurality, but you can actually make those other arguments in terms of fairness. Like, Donald Trump does a really good job of this. He talks about he's for free trade, but it has to be fair trade. He says that NATO countries have to pay their fair share. He talks about the one-sided Iran deal is unfair. So here's why he does that. Because, and this is what you were speaking to before, I don't know your name, the woman in black and the glasses. So this is based... Becky, you are right. So Becky, this is a book I recommend to you, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Differ on Politics and Religion is the subtitle. And he's developed 5 moral foundations. It's the prism through which people look at society and policies. And so there are 5 that he's developed. And if you took his survey, and you can do that on his website, yourmorals.org, and I'll tell you the punchline, that people who identify as conservatives, they care about all 5 of the moral foundations about the same. Whereas liberals, people who identify as liberals, are off the charts in terms of fairness and compassion. So for example, it was only conservatives that cared when Miley Cyrus was twerking, or that cared that Kaepernick didn't stand for the national anthem, or that Barack Obama didn't wear a flag on his lapel in 2008, or they care that there are kids coming across the border. Only conservative people care about that. But so that's why you can appeal to everyone on the basis of fairness and compassion. And you see there, money is not in the Venn diagram. It is not a moral foundation, and we tend to make too many of our, and I would argue Tom Coburn in that clip in the beginning, his was a money argument too. It was really a fairness appeal about we're burdening our children, we're mortgaging their future. But money is not a moral foundation, but we can make money arguments when we wrap them in a fairness or compassion appeal, the way Tom Coburn did. And so, for example, instead of railing against unsustainable entitlements, we can argue it's unfair that young people paying into the system now won't get these benefits when they retire. See the difference? Okay, so, and that's what I just said here. This is the Social Security question I just answered. Okay, so to engage persuadables or unaffiliateds, whatever you want to call them, we have to ask ourselves these questions. Who are we talking to? Are we talking to the choir? Or are we trying to talk beyond the choir? Are we repeating talking points that only resonate with ourselves? And are we listening with the intent to reply or the intent to understand? So that's how to get ready for a conversation. And then back to Simon Sinek, who started with why. He's the guy who said start with why. When I work with candidates, I encourage them to start with their purpose or belief and then talk about who they're fighting for. And then maybe they'll have time to get to how, but hopefully they don't ever have to talk about what's. Because say, I support Obamacare or I don't support Obamacare, that's a inherently divisive thing, to be fighting for what's. And so fighting for principles like we so often do, so better to fight for, so instead of fighting for low taxes or less regulations or smaller government, we need to fight for job searchers, the energy poor, the sick, the vulnerable who are affected when those bad policies are in place, and the vulnerable who will be helped when we take away those bad policies. So here I want to just emphasize Simon Sinek's point about starting with why. I think the most consequential why in human history is embedded in our Declaration of Independence. It's all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And like any good why, it elicits followers because people follow people who believe what they believe if you can articulate what they believe well. And that is a really good example. And what resulted was the United States of America. Then 100 years later, we had Abraham Lincoln having to preserve the Union and slavery by fighting the Civil War in order that government of the people, for the people, of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. It was essentially a recasting of that original why. And then 100 years later, Martin Luther King had a dream, not a 5-point plan. And I don't even have to tell you what the dream is, you know it. And people followed him because Americans who believed this and this instinctively followed Abraham Lincoln because they believed that our man-made laws have to comport with our natural laws and our natural rights. And within a year of his I Have a Dream speech, we had the Civil Rights Act. So I don't want to play this whole thing, it takes too long, but I just want to ask, this is an example of a politician, an American politician in the 21st century who gave a speech that was filled with whys. I think it's the most consequential speech so far in the 21st century. Does anyone want to take a guess which speech it is?
Say this century.
Sorry?
The past 100 years?
No, so far in the 21st century, so in the last 19 years. Huh? Anyone? I'm not going to play it all, but
It is that fundamental belief, I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper. That makes
2004.
It's what allows us to make the dreams and yet still come together as one American family. E pluribus unum. Out of many.
I'm not going to play the whole thing. It would take too long. Sorry. It was a great speech. It pole vaulted him from obscurity to being within the grasp of the presidency. He said, there's not a liberal America and a conservative America. There's not a black America and a white America and Latino America and Asian America. That's the United States of America. And he goes on to talk about these values that I had up there on the screen before. Trump's State of the Union speech this last spring was filled with whys, and it's not surprising that the snap polls right after said like 75% majorities actually liked it. And so I'm just going to mention a couple. America was founded on liberty and independence, not government coercion, domination, and control. We are born free and we will stay free. We must choose whether we will squander our inheritance or whether we will properly declare that we are Americans. We do the incredible, we defy the impossible, we conquer the unknown. Also, victory is not winning for our party, victory is winning for our country. So coming off as not partisan is really important. So here are some wise conversation starters that often when I have more time in my workshop, I like to elicit from the audience, but I handed this, one of your handouts is some suggested whys on different issues. But I just developed for today this one. These are conversation starters to engage persuadables. If you got into a conversation, you could say, it's not fair that Congress no longer passes most of the federal laws and regulations that are imposed on the American people. Instead, they're imposed by the regulators and the people in this leviathan, unaccountable, unelected administrative state, right? This actually comes from a column I wrote. As ruling elites have circumvented constitutional guardrails, concentrating power in this leviathan state, that elections have become these life and death slugfests. And I worry that half the country quakes in fear that the other half will punish them if they gain power. So my rhetorical question at the end of that column was, wouldn't it make America great again if we didn't have to care so much about who won the White House? Which would happen if you guys had your way with the Convention of the States. Okay, so I'm going to keep on going here. Countering the appeal of socialism is tough. It sounds so good, as Thomas Sowell said, and yet it's devastating. You can see from the satellite map of the Koreas, the South is alive and alight, the North is dead and dark. And that tells the story in one picture, but if you needed words, the way I like to explain it, profit has been sullied, capitalism has been sullied by people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but I like to suggest that profit is actually someone else's happiness. I have a picture coming up in a moment of her with her Movado watch and her Starbucks and her iPhone. She bought all those products, helping capitalist companies make a profit because they give her happiness, right? And that's why capitalism is based on the idea that if you help others, in return, others will help you. It's much better idea than socialism, which is based on this idea that government provides everything, so you never have to help anyone. Nor does anyone ever have to help you. Is that the kind of society that we want to live in? I'm going to just play this really quickly because I think it's really important. Helping understand how our system improves people's lives. It'll help you make that argument. Whoops.
Imagine you had to live in a country from one of these for the rest of your life. Which list would you choose? If you're like most people, you would choose A. Let's take a look at why that is. Take Chile and Venezuela. Chile's poverty rate is half that of Venezuela's, and its inflation rate is a fraction of the size. Actually, all of List A appears to be better off than B. Look at income per person. It's 10 times higher on average in List A. But these lists aren't organized by income. They're organized by economic freedom. List A countries have the most free economies in the world. List B, the least free. Across the globe, we see a strong relationship between economic freedom and people's quality of life. For instance, people in the most free countries earn, on average, over 8 times more than people in the least free. The poor earn 10 times more. People in the most free countries are happier. They have better protected civil rights, cleaner environments, and the average person lives 20 years longer. The freest countries also have less corruption, less infant mortality, less child labor, and less unemployment. So if you care about improving people's lives, then you really care about economic freedom. And having economic freedom means your property is protected under an impartial rule of law. You're free to trade with others for what you need and want. Your money keeps its value because your national currency is stable. And government stays small relative to the size of the economy. For years, the US was among the world leaders in economic freedom. But over the last decade, the US's ranking fell, and it's projected to keep falling. The question is, will our quality of life fall with it?
So that was made in 2015. So we've improved a little bit since then in terms of quality of life and economic freedom. I'm going to rush through the socialism stuff. I do want to come back to this, though. I mentioned before that Bernie Sanders and others have made this argument for socialism, that a handful of rich people should not run the country, but a handful of politicians should, which is implied by what he wants. He often looks to the Nordic countries, that they're his model, but they're not socialists. They actually reformed their governments. They made their money on capitalist systems in the 70s. They instituted socialist policies, but then realized that their economies were failing, people were hurting, they had to reform. They did tax cuts and some of those socialist Scandinavian countries are higher up on the economic freedom ladder now than the United States. Okay, so the 6 powers in the persuasion journey. I want to put this all together by telling you my example, and then we're going to go through each one and try to workshop the specific Convention of the States issues that you guys are working on, and then we'll end. So I've mentioned all of these. The one I haven't mentioned yet is You Are the Message. I will talk about that in a moment. But suffice it to say that when you're in person, you're going to be more persuasive. You have the advantage of the nonverbal communication cues that can help people like you before you even open your mouth. So here's my story. I was at a birthday party sitting opposite somebody, and she happened to mention, this was in the spring of 2014, she said she liked Obamacare. I had to stifle my 2010 self, the one that was writing those op-eds after Obamacare came out. I had to stifle myself about what was wrong with it. And instead, I asked a clarifying question, because I wanted to understand what her concern was so I could validate it. So I said, well, what is it you like about Obamacare? And she said, well, I like the fact that my son can stay on my policy until he's 26. I'll tell you, I happen to disagree with that particular policy, but I didn't say that. I wanted to validate her concern, and my 80% friend isn't my 20% foe. So I said, you know what, I don't blame you one bit for that, because it's hard enough nowadays for kids graduating college to get a good job, never mind a good job with good healthcare benefits. And then my pivot, using my pivoting device, I just worry. And I said, you know, I just worry about the people in the healthcare system now whose lives are getting completely upended. And then my story. I was in the healthcare system last year, and I had breast cancer, and in the fall of 2013, I was getting treated in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering at the very moment that those Obamacare exchanges and the website were going live, and people were finding out that they were losing, and I was with people in the waiting room at Memorial Sloan Kettering who had just found out that they were losing access. Not only had they lost their insurance policy, but they were losing access to the very institution and doctors that had been keeping them alive, and that's not fair. And she sat back and she's like, wait a second, I'm supposed to be the caring one here. I'm the virtuous one. She didn't have much of a retort except to say, gee, I guess you can't trust everything politicians tell you, which is actually a very good thing. I was pleased to hear that, because one of my messages to you is you have the power to influence people in your networks if you approach them the right way. And that's what these 6 powers are about. So the first one, I mentioned the message. 50 to 90% of communication is actually nonverbal if it's in person. So what are you projecting with your body language? And your tone of voice and speaking pace? Are you using your facial expressions to augment, not subtract from your message? And I will tell you that smiling, I tried this on the sidewalks of New York City. Well, I was walking down the sidewalk, I would smile at people, and even in New York City, they would smile back. It works because it causes a reaction, a chemical reaction in your brain that makes people predisposed to liking you. So smiling is the first thing I want to encourage you to do. Eye contact, looking people in the eye, head nods are very affirming. People then think, gee, I agree, that person is listening to me and maybe even agreeing with me, and that's affirming for the other person. An open posture, I would suggest. Yeah. Now, I know you might be cold. I'm often cold.
No, I've never had an open posture. Or mine.
When you're talking to someone who disagrees with you, try. And then also connecting gestures like you see there, you know, sort of Bill Clinton style, except in the wake of the Me Too movement, maybe not a good idea for some of the men. Okay, so things to avoid are the contemptuous body language. This is a total exaggeration, but of course no rolling eyes, crossed arms, pursed lips, finger pointing, furrowed brow. And sometimes when we get in a heated discussion, we get this furrowed brow, like you can't stand to listen to what the other is saying. You've got to try to power that instinct down. Okay, so here's the power of digestive listening, what I tried to demonstrate when I was talking to the woman who liked Obamacare, to ask a clarifying question, then to get her response so that I could validate it. That's how you get people on, you know, remember, persuasion is a journey to common ground that people instinctively share, but in this tribal partisan era, it's hard to get people to follow you to the common ground they instinctively share. So listen, ask questions. You've got to quiet the chatter in your mind, ask clarifying questions, listen, don't lecture, and certainly don't debate, try to validate by commenting agreeably. So in other words, this is one of Stephen Covey's habits of effective people: seek first to understand and then be understood. So to get people to feel heard, again, listen to understand, don't lecture. Right before you are making you want to ask a clarifying question, just pause. Just kind of try to get someone to think, that whoever you're talking to, and by the way, this should be authentic. I'm not trying to teach you acting class here. to authentically try to listen, maybe take a pause before you ask the question. And the question should be how, why, or what, not yes or no type questions, to really get them to explain what they're for, like, what is it you like about Obamacare? And then identify what's right, not just what's wrong with what they said. So I validated her. I didn't agree with the policy of keeping your kid on your policy until 26, but I said, I don't blame you. So you don't have to agree. You could just say, I don't blame you, or I get it. And then using yes and instead of but, because but is divisive. But is something that will instinctively make them less inclined to listen to you. And then also repeating back to someone what you heard them say makes them feel heard. It's not what you say, it's what people hear. And you want to hear them too. And so I would suggest in this hyper-partisan era that we really want to engage to understand, try to achieve a more perfect union. Abraham Lincoln gave his second inaugural address before the end of the Civil War, before he was assassinated, to an audience of people that actually included slave owners, people who still believed in slavery. And he said, with malice toward none, with charity for all. I suggest we can approach people who disagree with us the same way. Got to be careful to not use these empathy blockers that undermine your ability to listen and the other person to feel heard. We often have a dominating response, telling people how to solve their problem, for example. Or the other one is the avoidance one, oh, you'll be just fine. Or the judgmental response, that, that's ridiculous or stupid, that idea is stupid. We want to try to listen with compassion, the golden rule, listen to others the way you would want them to listen to you. And begin with the end in mind. Maya Angelou had it right when she said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So try to make sure that people feel heard and cared for. So making it amenable, not adversarial, gracious, not argumentative, thoughtful, not forceful. And then greasing it with positivity, like I did in my example. I don't blame you for wanting that policy. The third point here, the power of fighting for people. As Arthur Brooks said, the winning side always fights for people, not things. And so that's why we need to identify the vulnerable who are hurt by the bad policies and the vulnerable helped by the good ones. I'm not going to play this, but it is Arthur Brooks making the point about fighting for people. And if you have any doubt that the winning side always fights for people, you see here that Donald Trump talked about the forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer, and Hillary referred to many of them as deplorables. This is Van Jones after the election. He's the one that said the 2016 election was a white lash. But he actually went up to the upper Midwest and discovered people, two-time Obama voters, who were so disappointed in Hillary, they hurt them because she didn't care about them. I'm not going to play this. And so oftentimes when I'm doing this workshop, we workshop who are the vulnerable who are hurt by renewable mandates, for example. I met with a candidate for statewide office. I asked him, who's hurt by Jared Polis's proposal to have energy mandates, 100% renewables by 2035, I think it was, and to ban fracking. And his response was, energy companies. And I'm like, no, that's not the response. Who's hurt by those policies are the people who can least afford it, people who live on limited disposable incomes, low incomes, whose standard of living is sacrificed when energy prices artificially go up, affecting all the prices in the economy, everything they have to buy. So they have to make a choice, literally, between do they put protein on the table or do they fill up their car? That's not fair. Those are examples. Here's an example of, I don't have, okay. So I normally like to go through how can you identify we talked about who are the vulnerable on the minimum wage, and the universal basic income is about the same. Who are the vulnerable on the renewables and fracking I just mentioned? Who are the vulnerable who are helped by school choice? Anyone want to volunteer an answer? Who's helped by school choice?
People that don't have a choice.
People who don't have a choice and are relegated to really bad schools,
Kids in failing schools.
and who are they? Who do they tend to be?
A lot of them are minorities and
And that's not fair. Okay, good. All right. Now, use the fairness and compassion frame. We've talked about and that we can reach everyone with that frame. I'm going to skip this. I think you understand that point. And then sometimes I like to workshop how to put the fairness and compassion frame around these issues. And we're going to try to do that at the end with our issues. So the last point here is the power of story. My story about being in Sloan Kettering, I think, was very powerful for this woman. And you know, people think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it's the other way around. Good stories are very compelling. And that's because they convey emotion, they help make a connection, and they build your credibility. And Stalin had it right when he said that one death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic. This is a story from a picture that went viral in September of 2015 when the migrants were leaving Syria and the boat more or less capsized. Only the father of the family survived, and the 3-year-old son washed up on a Turkish beach. And this caused this momentary upwelling of support for the migrants. It radically changed policies on the continent. So really powerful stories can change, make significant changes. We don't have time to workshop stories about your issue here, but so now the last power of persuasion, the power of pivoting. I've talked about I worry that, and I ask and asking rhetorical questions. When you say imagine, like when I was writing about the Baltimore riot several years ago, I asked people to imagine. I started out, instead of blaming one side or the other, I said that it's a miscarriage of justice and the civil rights struggle of our time, that there are people, millions of people in the United States, the richest country in the world, still living in pockets of destitution, deprived of the dignity and fulfillment of work. And imagine if they had the opportunity to have work, how much better their lives could be. So you bring people, persuasion is about bringing people to a vision that they don't yet possess. And using imagine is one of those rhetorical devices that helps them. And then FBI is something, do I have that in here? No, I don't know if I do. Let me teach this right now. So when you express a feeling, so FBI is a way to pivot to common ground. It's also a way to show people that you care. You express a feeling, then you point to the behavior or a specific policy that's causing an adverse consequence. So in my minimum wage example, I worry about the most vulnerable in our society, young minorities. If the minimum wage goes up from 10 to 15, how will those who don't have a job now ever get a job? And I worry about them. You know, so you show the consequences. I worry that young minorities suffering high unemployment won't ever get on the social mobility ladder if the minimum wage is increased. That's the example there. So let me just go back. I'm not going to play this video, but I do want to play this. So Campus Reform went to, and then I'm almost done. Campus Reform went to the University of Miami, and they asked the kids there what they thought of the Green New Deal. And without exception, all of them who identify as progressive liberals, they liked it. And then he went on to ask them about the elements of the Green New Deal. He didn't tell them these elements are bad. He asked questions and then got them to give their own responses that allowed them to come to their own conclusions. And so I've only got a brief portion of this. You don't see the beginning where they're all saying, I like the Green New Deal, but you do see just the tail end of that and then the rest of this video.
Anything that would bring research dependence on fossil fuels is really... Definitely support this movement.
Some of the things in the plan I want to get your opinion on. So the plan says within 10 years, we're going to completely outlaw coal, natural gas, and oil. So gasoline, anything like that in 10 years.
I don't agree with that. To be honest with you, I think we need those things to live.
And I do not think it is feasible in 10 years. I don't think that that would be something that would be able to be done in such a short amount of time.
I think 10 years is a little extreme because I feel like there's such a big global market and economic impact of oil businesses, albeit it might not be good for the environment, but you can't deny there's a big economic impact to these companies.
What's your thought on that?
Sounds like a reach, honestly.
You think that's feasible?
No.
If you're unwilling to work, we will still supply help for your salary and help for a living wage.
No, absolutely not.
If you're not willing to contribute to society, I don't think that the people who are contributing should pay for you. So I disagree with that.
I feel like it kind of sends the poor message of, you know, you can just get away with not doing anything and, you know, getting money. It's kind of stupid. I don't like that personally. Unwilling isn't the best way to go about things. Like, I don't want to go to college, but I have to get a job, so.
Everyone needs to contribute. That's the only way society works.
I don't know about that one. I think that if you're unwilling, that I don't know if you should receive money for that.
If you didn't want to go to class, if you were unwilling to go to class, should I still give you a good grade?
No. Yeah, like, people definitely need a job, need to work.
Eliminate almost all air travel with high-speed rails. What's your thought on that?
I feel like it's kind of the same one. It's like, I feel like 10 years is a little extreme for that.
I don't think it should be eliminated altogether. I think it's definitely like can be an option. I think the more options we have, the better.
I think that's drastic. I haven't heard of that one yet.
Yeah, I can't see that happening either, honestly.
We've come so far to get to this point where we are right now with using these resources, and to say, oh, we have to get rid of it in 10 years seems a little too much to me.
Who's going to pay for all of it? Who's going to offset the trillions of dollars cost that it would be?
Right. I don't know. Nobody knows. Like, it's kind of like, who's really gonna pay? I don't, like...
Based on what you've heard from these, does it change your perception of the plan at all?
Yeah, a lot.
Sometimes you need to take extreme measures to save the environment, but I don't think that is like, I think it's a bit too extreme.
It doesn't sound like something I would be behind.
I don't agree with us having to, take away flying in the air. I don't agree with, taking away coal and things like that, and I don't agree with everyone getting money for doing nothing.
The point I really want to make with this is, I told you before, what I discovered in writing a column is that if you approach people the right way, you can actually bring them to the common ground they instinctively share.
The point is that you can bring people to common ground that they instinctively share if you approach them the right way. And that's the main message that I want to leave you with, is how to approach people the right way. So we're going to just take a moment to go through the 3 pillars of the Convention of the States. And I'd love to get a volunteer to, I think we don't have time for all 3, but just to do fiscal restraints. So the first one is eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse, permanently limit spending and taxation, and secure the nation's fiscal future. Does anyone want to take a stab at identifying who are the vulnerable that will help if we achieve that, and why is that fair or compassionate to institute that? Does anyone want to take a shot? Who are the vulnerable let's start. Who are the vulnerable who would be helped if we had fiscal restraints?
Future generations.
Future generations. Okay.
I think
children and grandchildren.
All children and grandchildren.
I think even today, not going forward to children and grandchildren, which I agree with completely, there are many vulnerable people today. I grew up just off of a reservation and saw the disparity, yes, Navajo, and saw the disparity that existed there, and understood the mentality that existed with the tribal council, which really only worked to empower themselves. And I saw all the poor underneath that, which there was very little effort done to help them. That's a micro example, but the same macro example exists in every community of the United States.
Okay, so does anyone want to give another shot at this?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the vulnerable are, there are lots of vulnerable. In in some ways it's manipulative in a sense, but if you're trying to communicate something, you want the receiver to do, know, think, or feel something, then you have to get inside whatever is important to them. For a lot of people in some younger generations right now, they're not so much concerned with children because they don't have them, or grandchildren because they don't even have children, but they're real concerned with themselves. And so if they can see themselves in the vulnerable or the group of vulnerable that you can describe, then they'll start feeling something and maybe start trusting what you're saying. So who's vulnerable to government waste and abuse? Everybody who's ever had a dime and didn't want somebody 3,000 miles away to decide how to spend it, especially on a friend of theirs in a contract that would give them a kickback. So who's vulnerable to governmental fraud, waste, and abuse? Everybody. Everybody you know, everybody who's ever tried to have a house, everybody who wants a better life for themselves, or their friends, or their family. The vulnerability is all of us who aren't in the positions in the government that are making these kind of decisions that were never theirs to begin with fairly.
It's not funny that the cronies, they get the bailouts and the rest of us have to live paying the taxes that fund those bailouts. That's not fair.
Thank you. So both of my boys are in their 20s and they just got a job, a really great job. One of them was, I just guaranteed like $88,000 a year. And so, but they've always been for this, you know, Bernie Sanders kind of style. And so if I can tell them, listen, you realize you're going to be taxed 50%. And it's just going to be increasing with these, you know, the way that things are going. It's going to be increasing. You will not make $88,000. And so, and that's not fair.
Also, look at the countries that have not had fiscal restraints, the basket cases around the world. What do people who live there, apart from the wealthy, what do they live like? That's not fair.
I was an interpreter, a Spanish interpreter, so I speak to people from Cuba who have left. And they get, I believe, like 6 eggs, some lard, some rice, beans. And there's some of them who get text, you know, messages from friends. And they are eating like a piece of bread for dinner. So this isn't like a perchance. This is what is going on.
Venezuela, they're eating their dogs. They're eating it all. Anyone else? We have two more. Let me go to the other two quickly. So limiting federal power, restore the constitutional structures, give teeth to the 10th Amendment, which makes the states sovereign over the federal government, and return power to states and people. How does that help the vulnerable? Who are the vulnerable? Anyone else? Okay. Someone who hasn't talked yet. Let me go.
I don't think I need it, if everybody can hear me. I'm from Brighton, Colorado. I work with the agricultural community, and I met a gentleman in the recall policy the other day. It is 4th generation, their farm for 104 years. He went through the expenses federal government placed on farmers and ranchers. They are the vulnerable, and then we are, because the prices of food go up, and we gotta eat.
Good.
Now I've lost my train of thought. No, but one of the things that really shows this dramatically is that they are moving, is that the department that takes care of all our national parks, they're moving it to Grand Junction. And apparently there are people who work in that department in Washington, D.C. who are furious that they're going to be required to move to Colorado? Why would they ever? These are the people who are regulating Colorado. And yet they are furious that they're going to have to move there. We need people who understand Colorado, regulating Colorado.
Right, and that was...
I understand, we don't actually want them.
That's right.
Okay, this is a current example, but you'll find in your packets there's a
an example of it's not a current factual example of a short presentation to a GOP group that I had given. It's only a GOP group because they invited. We could give a presentation to any group, regardless of party, just to make it clear. But I cite an old example in there about Roscoe Filburn, and that's from the case of Filburn v. Whitburn, or Whitburn v. Filburn. That's the one that the Supreme Court decided and allowed the expansive application of the Interstate Commerce Clause to commerce that's not interstate. And so Roscoe Filburn was a victim of the administrative state because he just was growing some wheat on his farm he was going to use for his own purposes and never sell. Not only not in interstate commerce, but not even in interstate commerce. And the Supreme Court said it's okay for the federal government to regulate that. And that's really where we got that's the fountainhead of all the overregulation, the administrative state, the agencies that can make the law, enforce the law, and then tell you and adjudicate whether you've broken the law. And so Roscoe Filburn is my example of somebody hurt by the administration.
Right, that goes back to the abuse of the Commerce Clause that has completely changed its definition. Is there somebody else with their hand up? Oh, here we go.
My wife and I just got back from Washington, D.C. day before yesterday, and just driving around in Washington, D.C. and looking at all the buildings and the various government departments that have got hundreds of thousands of employees working in these agencies that are setting policies and making rules, all without any sort of legislative oversight at all. Just the sheer size of that is depressing to me because it shows how little control anybody has over anything. And when you start talking about trying to limit federal power, you've got an entire city that revolves around federal power, and that's frightening to me.
Well, and it's frightening, that's what goes to that, what I had on the slide earlier. This was an argument I used in one of my columns, that half the country quakes in fear that the other side will win a presidential election and use that federal power against them. And so when I have conversations with people about this, I like to point out, well, wouldn't you feel more comfortable if there was less power in Washington and more power locally with people that you could approach and you could talk to about your concerns? Generally, you get like an affirmative.
I don't have a specific example, but really have a question for the group on this particular item in the Convention of States. One of the topics that certainly Colorado faces, California faces, lots of states face, is a great concern over the cost of housing. And I'm just wondering, is there federal overreach that has driven up the cost of housing? And can we as a group use that with examples of how that's occurred, that's caused housing prices to rise and then left people vulnerable as a result?
Well, I think of California when I think of housing prices, and New York, and those are more state policies, state regulations and zoning, and what federal policies, and they have the right to do that. We would argue that states' rights, they have the right to, like what they've just done in California, said that Uber and Lyft have to consider their employees, full employees, giving them full benefits. We'll see how long Uber and Lyft last in California. And it gave an opportunity for gig employees who just wanted to work, at night to fund their college degree or whatever, a chance to work and earn a little extra money. But they're going to overregulate that. I don't know about federal. I'm not sure about federal. But you know what? We could go on. There's so much to say, and the last one here is term limits. How would term limits, I think it goes to this point where we were just saying, here, I'll give it to you so you can make the point.
I actually wanted to, apologize in advance, but I just want to go back to the last one just for a moment.
Sure.
That this gets complex fast when you start talking about the details, but the truth is, again, we're all vulnerable. And if you want to turn that into a question, the question is really, how far away do you want the people to be making decisions about your day-to-day life? Do you want people 3,000 miles away making decisions about whether you turn left or right at the next corner, whether you use a straw to drink your soda or whatever it is that you're drinking at lunchtime? If you don't, if you think that's ridiculous, then you already understand. You already understand that we want to limit the amount of power exercised by people from distant locations over all of our day-to-day lives. There's some decisions obviously have to be made there, but anything that doesn't have to be made there is made poorly and ill-informed and without regard to most of our interests at that distance. I live about 95 miles from the state capitol. I don't want them making a bunch of decisions about my day-to-day life, let alone somebody back in DC. Right? I live 30 miles tops at any given time from the mayor of Colorado Springs. I don't want them making a bunch of decisions in my daily lives. I've got it. And I think that's true for all people in the country. We don't need a lot of help there. The help we need is you staying out of it.
You want control over your own life. You want, you're pro-choice, and you want to choose which.
I think everybody wants control over their own life.
Right? No, absolutely. I will tell you. Here's just briefly. I had written this. These are some thoughts I had to say. I worry that when those making the law don't ever stand for election, then no one is held accountable. Americans who are deprived of their rights have no one to take their grievances then. It's not right that Congress delegates lawmaking power to the executive branch agencies, then disclaims any responsibility for the laws resulting from that delegation. And then it's not fair that Congress no longer passes most of the federal laws and regulations that are imposed on the American people. So those are just some of the thoughts that I had. Okay.
Then you can see the bureaucracy rejecting even that oversight, right? When you see Department of Justice employees sitting in congressional oversight hearings telling them they're not going to answer questions because an attorney also employed by the Department of Justice has told them that they shouldn't.
Right. I don't know, we never got to the bottom of the IRS scandal either. Okay, so last slide here. So I know that we often feel beleaguered under the circumstances, often at election time. But I don't want you to ever forget that we inhabit the moral high ground. The truth is on our side, even public opinion, when we make the arguments persuasively and winsomely, as hopefully I've given you a few tidbits on how to do that. And I want you to remember that we are the luckiest people who have ever walked this earth. And the question that I think brings us all here today is, will our children and grandchildren and great-great-great-great-grandchildren be able to say the same thing? And the truth is, there's a direct line from our founders to today. They had the courage to challenge a omnipotent government that was too big and too intrusive as well. And the result was the creation of the United States of America. And our challenge today is to reclaim it. So I want to send you out with a prayer. Help us remember the rich American past we have inherited, and keep us ever mindful of the bright American future we must secure and enrich. And may the memories of cherished leaders which guide our actions inspire us all to live lives worthy of remembrance. Thank you.